So picture this. You're sitting at your kitchen table. Maybe it's a Sunday morning, you've got coffee, maybe some toast, and you're just kind of scrolling through Zillow the way people scroll through social media now, not because you're seriously looking, but because it's become this weird ritual, this thing we do to torture ourselves a little. And you find it, a house. A real house with a yard and a driveway and enough bedrooms that your in-laws could theoretically visit without sleeping on an air mattress in the hallway. And the price says $249,000. And for like 4 whole seconds, you feel something. Hope, maybe. Or at least the suggestion of hope. And then you do the math. And then that feeling goes away. This is, honestly, the defining financial experience of a generation of people right now. This exact moment, the Zillow scroll, the brief flicker of possibility, and then the slow, quiet deflation when reality catches up. It's happening in living rooms and apartments and parents' basements all across the country, and it's happening to people who are not, by any reasonable measure, failing at life. People with degrees, jobs, some savings, people doing everything they were told to do. My name is Emmy, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, not just the numbers, but the psychology of it, the way money shapes how we see ourselves and our futures, the gap between what we were promised and what we're actually living. I find the $250,000 house question genuinely fascinating, not because it's a cheerful topic, but because buried inside it is something more interesting than just housing is expensive now. There's a real story about income, geography, timing, and what affordability actually means in the modern economy. And once you see it clearly, some things start to make more sense, and some things get more frustrating, but at least you're oriented. So let's actually talk about this. Who can afford a $250,000 house in 2026? Not in a theoretical way, in a real what does your bank account need to look like way. Because I think a lot of people are walking around with a completely distorted picture of this, and that distortion is costing them, not just money, but clarity. Let's start at the very beginning, which is the number itself. $250,000 sounds on the surface like a modest house price, and in a lot of ways it used to be. If you go back 15 years, $250,000 was the median home price in much of the United States. It was solidly middle of the pack, the kind of number that implied, a normal house for a normal family in a normal American suburb. But here's what's happened since then, and this is important to actually sit with. The national median home price as of 2026 is hovering somewhere between $400,000 and $430,000, depending on which data source you look at, which means $250,000 isn't the middle anymore. It's the bottom, it's entry level, it's the floor. And in a lot of major cities, we're talking anything in California, most of the Northeast, Seattle, Denver, Miami, Austin, $250,000 doesn't buy you a house at all. It buys you a parking spot, maybe, or a very sad condo with an HOA that sends passive-aggressive letters about your porch furniture. So the first thing to understand is that when we say $250,000 house, we're already working within a geography problem. These houses exist, but they are concentrated in specific parts of the country, and the places where they're common are often the places that people have complicated feelings about moving to. We'll come back to that, but let's assume for now that a $250,000 house is on the table. What does it actually cost you? Here's where I want to slow down, because I think most people either oversimplify or completely gloss over what affordability really means. It is not just the sticker price, not even close. If you're putting 20% down on a $250,000 home, which, by the way, is $50,000 in cash just sitting there, ready to hand over, your loan is $200,000. And at current interest rates, which in 2026 are sitting somewhere in the high 6 to low 7% range, depending on your credit score and loan type, your monthly mortgage payment on that $200,000 is roughly $1,300 to $1,400, just principal and interest, not insurance, not property taxes, not the random thing that breaks in month 3 because it was always going to break, and the inspector technically mentioned it, but in that vague way inspectors do, where you don't realize what they said until you're standing in a flooded basement. When you add property taxes, which vary enormously by state, but let's say 1.1% annually, which is close to the national average, you're adding another $230 a month. Homeowners insurance adds maybe $100 to $150. If you're putting less than 20% down, you're also paying PMI, which can add $80 to $150 more. So your real monthly cost, the number that actually leaves your bank account every month, is closer to $1,700 to $1,900, potentially more. Now let's talk about what income you need for that to make sense. The standard rule, the one that lenders use, the one that most financial advisors still reference, is that your housing costs should be no more than 28% of your gross monthly income. Some people stretch it to 30, 33, even 36 when they're feeling optimistic or desperate, but 28% is the traditional benchmark. So if your monthly housing payment is $1,800 and that represents 28% of your gross income, then your gross monthly income needs to be about $6,400, which means an annual salary of roughly $77,000 before taxes. $77,000. That sounds achievable, right? And in some ways it is. The median U.S. household income in 2026 is somewhere between $74,000 to $78,000, depending on the source. So technically, the $250,000 house and the median U.S. income are in the same general zip code. But here's where I want to introduce the word technically, because it's doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. The median is not the whole story, not even close. When people say the median household income is $77,000, they're averaging across a lot of very different situations. Two-income households, single-income households, people in their peak earning years, people just starting out, people in expensive cities where that $77,000 doesn't go far enough, people in small towns where the same income stretches much further. The median smooths over all of that. And when we're talking about buying a house, we're not really talking about your income in isolation. We're talking about your income relative to where you live, relative to your debt, relative to whether you have $50,000 sitting around for a down payment. Let me break down that last piece separately, because I think it's the part that stops the most people. The down payment problem is real and it is brutal, and it doesn't get talked about enough. We talk a lot about monthly payments and mortgage rates, and those are important, but there's this initial hurdle, this toll you have to pay before you even get on the highway that blocks people regardless of what they earn. $50,000. That is what 20% down looks like on a $250,000 house. Let's talk about geography, because this is honestly where the most interesting and underappreciated variation lives. A $250,000 house means completely different things depending on where you're looking. In San Jose, California, $250,000 doesn't buy you a house. In Manhattan, you might get a small studio co-op if you're lucky. In Boston or Seattle or Washington, D.C., you're probably looking at a condo in a neighborhood that may or may not have a functioning grocery store within walking distance. But in Memphis, Tennessee, $250,000 buys you a 4-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood. In Cleveland, Ohio, it buys you a renovated Craftsman in an established suburb. In Oklahoma City, in Birmingham, in Wichita, in dozens of mid-sized American cities, $250,000 is not entry-level. It's genuinely comfortable. It's a real house. So there's this interesting geographic split happening right now, where affordability has basically bifurcated the country into 2 categories: places where $250,000 is inaccessible, and places where $250,000 is reasonable, but you may be sacrificing things: job market depth, social networks, weather preferences, proximity to family, that have real value, even if they don't show up in a mortgage calculation. Now, you don't technically have to put 20% down. There are FHA loans that allow 3.5% down, which on a $250K house is only $8,750. There are VA loans for veterans that require nothing down at all. There are conventional loans that allow 3 to 5% down, so the barrier is lower than people sometimes think. But here's the trade-off. Every dollar you don't put down is a dollar you're borrowing, which means more interest paid over time. And if you're below 20%, you're paying PMI every single month until you've built up enough equity, which at minimum takes years. And your monthly payment is higher. And lenders may offer you a slightly worse interest rate. So not putting 20% down is a completely valid path, but it is not free. And even if we're talking about 3.5% down, $8,750, that's still nearly $9,000 in cash that needs to exist before you can even make an offer. For someone earning $50,000 a year, taking home maybe $3,200 a month after taxes, saving $9,000 while paying rent and existing as a human in the world can take 2 to 4 years depending on expenses. And during those 2 to 4 years, the houses that were at $250,000 are often at $270,000 or $285,000. The finish line moves. That's the treadmill feeling. That's why people feel stuck. Okay, so who specifically can actually do this? Let me paint a few real portraits because I think this is more useful than abstract numbers. Portrait 1. The dual-income couple in a mid-cost city. Let's call them Marcus and Priya. They're both 31. Marcus works in logistics management, earns $52,000. Priya does medical billing, earns $48,000. Combined household income, $100,000. They live in a mid-sized city, let's say Columbus, Ohio, or Raleigh, North Carolina, or maybe Boise. They have $40,000 in savings built up over 4 years of being pretty deliberate about not lifestyle inflating too hard after their raises. They have student loans, $600 a month combined, and one car payment of $350. For them, a $250,000 house is tight but doable. Their mortgage application looks reasonable. Their debt-to-income ratio is manageable. They can put 15% down, pay PMI for a few years, and have some emergency fund left over. This works. It's not spacious financially, they'll have to be careful, but it's real. Portrait 2. The single earner in the same city. Same city, same $250,000 house, but now it's just one person. Let's say Jordan, 34, earns $65,000, which is genuinely a good income, above median for an individual. Jordan has $22,000 saved, has $400 a month in student loans, and no other major debt. For Jordan, this is harder. Not impossible, but genuinely harder. The $22,000 gets them to an 8.8% down payment, enough to qualify, but they're paying PMI. Their debt-to-income ratio is fine, but not luxurious, and they're essentially alone in this financially, which means if the furnace dies or the roof needs patching or they have a medical thing, the buffer is thin. Jordan can probably do it, but they will feel it every month. Portrait 3. The $40,000 earner. Now, let's talk about someone making $40,000 a year, which is, by the way, not a fringe income. The median individual income in the United States is right around $40,000. Half of all workers earn less than that. So this is not a marginal scenario. This is the middle of the distribution. At $40,000 a year, take-home pay is roughly $2,700 to $2,900 a month, depending on where you live and your tax situation. If we use the 28% rule, your maximum comfortable housing payment is about $780 a month. A $250,000 house at current rates costs you $1,700 to $1,900 all in. That's nearly double what the income supports. For someone earning $40,000, a $250,000 house is technically financially out of reach. Unless, and this is a meaningful unless, they have something else working in their favor: a partner, a large inheritance or gift for a down payment, an unusually low cost of living in their region, no other debt, some combination of factors that shifts the math. But on a single $40,000 income alone in 2026, the numbers are just not there. And I think this is the part that breaks people's hearts a little bit, because $40,000 feels like a real income. It's what a lot of teachers make: retail managers, medical assistants, administrative professionals, people who are working full-time, contributing, showing up, and they're being told by the math that even the cheapest tier of home ownership isn't designed for them.
And this is where it gets psychologically complicated, because the people who most need the affordable market, the young professionals, the single earners, the people trying to get on the ladder, are disproportionately concentrated in the expensive cities. They went there for the jobs, for the opportunity, for the version of their career they were building, and they're now priced out of ownership in the city where their life is, and the affordable cities are somewhere else, somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere that requires building an entire life again from scratch. That's not a small ask. That's not just move to a cheaper place. That's dismantle everything you've built and relocate to somewhere where you know almost no one, in hopes that the lower housing costs make up for it. Some people do this. Remote work has made it more viable than it ever was. And for a lot of people who've made that move, it's worked out genuinely well. But we should be honest that it's a real sacrifice, not just a sensible financial pivot. Now, I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough airtime in these conversations, which is debt. Because when we talk about who can afford a house, we usually focus on income and down payment. But the third variable, the one that quietly tanks a lot of would-be buyers, is existing debt, specifically student loans, car loans, and credit card balances. Lenders don't just look at your income, they look at your debt-to-income ratio, which is your total monthly debt payments divided by your gross monthly income. The threshold that most lenders use is 43%, meaning your total debt, including your new mortgage, shouldn't exceed 43% of gross monthly income. Some lenders are stricter. So let's say you earn $70,000 a year, which is $5,833 a month gross. 43% of that is $2,508. That's the ceiling for all your debt combined: mortgage, student loans, car payment, credit cards. If you have $600 in student loan payments, $350 in car payment, and $150 in minimum credit card balances, that's $1,100 a month already spoken for, which leaves you only $1,408 for a mortgage. At current rates, that gets you maybe a $180,000 to $190,000 loan, which, with a 10% down payment, means you're shopping for homes around $200,000 to $210,000, not $250,000, lower. Debt is the silent variable. It's the thing that makes a $70,000 earner feel like they should be able to buy a $250,000 house, but actually can't qualify for one, not because their income is too low, but because their existing obligations are eating the space that a mortgage would need to occupy. And this matters especially for millennials and the older edge of Gen Z, who are carrying more student debt than any previous generation and came of age during a period when car prices also spiked dramatically. These aren't people who made reckless financial decisions. They took out student loans because that was the expectation. They bought cars because they needed to get to work. And now those perfectly normal financial choices are creating friction in the home buying process that can take years to resolve. Let me spend a moment on the down payment assistance programs, because I think a lot of people don't know they exist. Every state has a housing finance agency, and most of those agencies offer some form of down payment assistance, either as a grant that doesn't have to be repaid or as a second loan that's deferred or low interest. Federal programs like the FHA loan, VA loan, and USDA loan, which actually covers rural areas and has no down payment requirement, exist specifically to lower the bar for entry. Some cities and counties have their own programs layered on top. First-time homebuyer classes, which you can often take online in a few hours, unlock access to additional assistance in a lot of places. There are employer-sponsored programs, particularly in healthcare and education, where institutions help employees with down payments as a retention tool. I'm not listing these to suggest that the affordability problem is solved or that these programs reach everyone who needs them. They don't. They have income limits, purchase price limits, geographic restrictions. They're not a panacea, But they do exist, and they matter, and the research consistently shows that a huge portion of people who would qualify for these programs have never heard of them. People who are quietly waiting to save $40,000 who could have gotten into a house 2 years ago with an $8,000 down payment and a grant to cover closing costs. The information gap here is real, and it costs real people real money in the form of additional years of rent paid to a landlord instead of equity being built in an asset they own. Here's something I think about a lot when I'm in this space, and it's maybe a little uncomfortable, but I think it's worth saying. There's a version of the affordability conversation that treats this as purely a mathematical problem. Get your income up, get your debt down, save your down payment, find a cheaper market. Check, 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 done. And the math version of this conversation isn't wrong. Those things matter enormously. Getting your income up does help. Reducing debt does help. Relocating does help. But there's also a systemic layer to this that I think it's intellectually dishonest to ignore. Housing supply in the United States has been artificially constrained for decades by zoning laws that prevent density, by building restrictions that limit new construction, by NIMBYism that consistently wins at local government meetings. The result is that the supply of homes has not kept pace with the demand for them, and that imbalance is the fundamental engine driving prices up. Individual financial choices can help individuals navigate that environment, but they don't change the environment. And the other layer is wage stagnation. Inflation-adjusted wages for a huge portion of the American workforce have barely moved over the past 30 years, while housing prices have risen dramatically. The 28% rule only works if income and housing costs move in roughly the same direction at roughly the same speed. They have not. None of this is an excuse for inaction at the individual level. You still have to deal with the world as it exists, not as it should be. But I think people deserve to know that the difficulty they're experiencing is not primarily a reflection of their personal financial failures. It's a reflection of structural conditions that were built up over decades and that are genuinely hard to change quickly. So, what do you actually do with all of this? If you're sitting here thinking, okay, but where does this leave me specifically? Let me try to be useful in a concrete way. If you're in the $70,000 to $100,000 household income range and you're not in a high-cost metro, the $250,000 house is probably reachable within the next 2 to 3 years with deliberate effort. The main levers are the down payment and the debt. Get a real picture of both, not a vague sense, but actual numbers. What is your current savings rate? What's your debt-to-income ratio right now? What would it look like if you paid off one loan or reduced one balance? If you're a single earner making under $55,000 in a mid to high-cost area, the honest advice is that the path to $250,000 home ownership probably runs through either a geographic shift, a significant income increase, a co-buyer, or a longer savings timeline than you'd like. None of those are easy, but knowing which one is your most realistic path is more useful than vague hope. And if you're in a high-cost market and $250,000 is simply not an option, the question isn't really about the $250,000 anymore. It's about whether you're building financial equity in other ways during your renting years, whether you're taking advantage of tax-advantaged accounts, whether you're positioned to buy when and if an opportunity arises. Renting while building savings and investments isn't failure. It's a different version of the same game. And if you haven't looked into down payment assistance programs in your state, please do that this week. Not next month, this week. It takes maybe 45 minutes to look up your state housing finance agency and see what you qualify for, and it might change your timeline meaningfully. I want to end this by pulling back just a little bit, because I think the $250,000 house question, when you sit with it long enough, is really a question about something bigger. It's a question about what kind of financial life is actually available to ordinary people in this moment. It's a question about whether the promise, work hard, live within your means, build something stable, still holds for some people in some places under some conditions, and it's genuinely broken for a lot of other people who aren't doing anything wrong. That gap between expectation and reality is worth being angry about. It's worth talking about, voting about, advocating about. But it's also worth working around individually with clear eyes and good information, because your life is happening now, and the structural problems may not resolve on your personal timeline. What I hope you take from this is not discouragement, but orientation. The people who can afford a $250,000 house in 2026 look like a specific set of circumstances: dual incomes, low existing debt, geographic flexibility, some savings, and a market that still has homes in that range. That's not everyone. It's not even most people in a lot of places. But understanding which of those variables you have, which you can change, and which you can't, that's the beginning of an actual plan instead of just a feeling. You're not crazy for finding this hard. The math is genuinely hard. But the math can also be worked, carefully, with patience, and with information. And that's worth something.